The rich man chose not to leave Maine after the designer woman finished the space. The morning in coastal Maine carried a gray that did not announce itself. It settled instead, evenly across the street, the dock at the end of the block, the shop windows that had already been wiped once and would be wiped again before noon. Inside a narrow storefront, Iris Calder stood a step back from the glass. She adjusted the display without haste. One fold of fabric was shifted less than an inch. A reflection was checked, then checked again from a lower angle. The light from outside filtered and soft and flat, catching on thread, on the faint dust that never fully left the air near the door. She worked with both hands visible. No music, no sign, just the quiet friction of cloth, wood, and glass. Across the street, Caleb Rowan had stopped walking. He stood where the curb dipped slightly, near the storm drain that carried rain toward the harbor. He did not cross. He did not look away. His coat remained buttoned, the collar still turned up from the walk. The distance between them stayed intact, measured by asphalt and a single parked truck. From where he stood, the window framed Iris and the room behind her. From where she stood, the glass returned the street as a pale overlay. Neither acknowledged the other. A gull passed overhead, its call stretched thin by the wind. Somewhere down the block, a door closed. The town continued its usual sequence of small sounds. Caleb did not raise his hand. He did not check the time. He remained long enough to be noticed. A woman carrying a paper bag from the bakery slowed as she passed. Her glance caught the stillness first, then the alignment of it. The man across the street. The woman inside the shop. The space between them holding, unclaimed. She continued on. Inside, Iris stepped closer to the glass and adjusted the display one last time. The movement was precise, practiced. When she straightened, her reflection merged briefly with the street behind her. For a moment, the outline of Caleb's coat appeared layered over her shoulder, faint and temporary. Nothing changed in her posture. Caleb shifted his weight once, not enough to suggest departure. The cold from the harbor moved through the street in shallow currents. He felt it in, his hands before he felt it anywhere else. A delivery truck rolled past at low speed, tires whispering over damp pavement. The driver did not look in either direction. When the truck cleared the view, the window was still there. The display was finished. Iris had stepped slightly to the side, checking from the corner now, her hands resting at her waist. Caleb remained where he was. The scene held long enough to register, then long enough again to feel intentional, even though no intention was declared. It was a moment that belonged to the street as much as to the two people occupying it. Eventually, Caleb turned. The motion was unremarkable. He walked in the same direction he had been going before he stopped, pace unchanged. Inside the shop, Iris reached for a cloth and wiped a faint mark from the glass, one that had been there before and would likely return by evening. She did not look up as he left the frame. From the end of the block, the storefront returned to being just another window. From the middle of the street, the space where Caleb had stood was already empty. What remained was the fact that both had been there, seen without comment. The town did not announce itself after that moment. It simply continued. Morning along the Maine coast arrived without brightness. The light stayed low and spread wide, thinning the edges of buildings instead of sharpening them. Gray did not mean absence here. It meant coverage. It moved from the water inward, settling on the dock planks, the roofs, the narrow streets that curved rather than cut straight through town. The harbor breathed in a steady rhythm. Waves met the pilings without force, a repeated contact that never asked for attention. Rope knocked gently against wood. A buoy rang once, then went quiet again. Fog drifted through in bands. It was not thick enough to hide anything fully. It softened distance instead. Boats appeared first as outlines, then as color, then as detail. A gull crossed low over the water, its call reaching shore a second later than expected. Caleb Rowan moved through the town as it woke. His steps followed the same route most mornings, though the order shifted depending on tide and weather. He passed the dock early, before the fishermen finished unloading. The smell of salt and fuel lingered without urgency. No one spoke loudly. Voices carried too easily in the cold air. A man on the dock nodded once. Caleb nodded back. Nothing more passed between them. The road from the harbor bent inward, following the line of older houses that had been built to face wind rather than views. Wood siding bore layers of paint, each one chosen for weather rather than fashion. Porches stayed narrow. Windows stayed small. Warmth was kept inside by design, not decoration. Rain began as a fine mist, almost unnoticeable at first. It gathered on coats, on hair, on the surface of the road. The sound came later, a soft accumulation against leaves and metal signs. Inside the shops, lights were already on. The bakery window glowed amber. The hardware store smelled faintly of oil and pine. A bell rang when someone entered, then rang again when they left. No one hurried. Iris Calder's shop sat halfway between the harbor and the town center. The sign above the door was modest, hand-painted years ago and touched up when needed. The window held its arrangement from earlier that morning. The fabric rested where she had left it, angled to catch what little light passed through the cloud cover. Inside, the air was warmer, not by much. The heat stayed low, steady. Shelves held folded textiles, paper patterns, small tools set back in drawers. Everything had a place, though nothing was arranged to impress. Iris moved between the work table and the front of the shop. She checked the seam she had been working on the night before, then folded the piece carefully and set it aside. The radio remained off. The only sound was the occasional car passing outside, tires hissing over damp pavement. The town filled gradually. A delivery truck backed into a space near the dock. The driver waited for someone to clear a path, then eased forward again. A woman walked her dog along the waterfront, stopping at the same bench she used every morning. The dog pulled once, then settled. Caleb stopped at the diner near the corner, the one with windows that fogged up by mid-morning. He took the same stool. The mug placed in front of him was already warm. No words were needed. Outside, the rain shifted. It grew steadier, then thinned again. The sky remained a uniform gray, neither heavy nor light. From time to time, someone looked toward Iris's shop window, not because it demanded attention, but because it had changed recently, and change in a small town registered on its own schedule. The glances were brief. No one lingered. Caleb passed the shop again later, this time without stopping. His reflection crossed the glass and moved on. Inside, Iris adjusted a chair near the work table, then returned to her task. The road along the coast curved away from town, following the shape of the land. It did not lead anywhere new. It led back again. Houses farther out stood closer to the water. Their paint showed more wear. Driftwood gathered along the shore, shifting slightly with each tide. The sea stayed calm, its surface broken only by the movement of birds and the slow return of boats. By afternoon, the fog lifted enough to show the far end of the harbor. Light remained flat. Colors stayed muted. The town looked the same from one end to the other, held together by repetition rather than landmarks. No one marked the moment when Caleb and Iris occupied the same stretch of street again, separated by only a few yards. A passerby noticed the alignment, then forgot it just as quickly. The scene did not ask to be remembered. The town accepted all of it without response. It was the kind of place where presence registered quietly, where being seen did not require acknowledgement. He woke before the day decided what it would be. The sky outside his window was still gray, not dark enough to belong to night, not light enough to count as morning. The ocean reached him first, its sound moving through the narrow space between sleep and waking. It did not rise or fall dramatically. It stayed even, reliable. Caleb Rowan lay still for a moment, listening. Then he stood. The floor was cold under his feet. He crossed the small room and opened the window a few inches wider. Damp air came in, carrying salt and the faint smell of kelp. Somewhere beyond the houses, waves met the shore in a steady pattern that did not need to be followed to be known. He closed the window, just enough to keep the wind from pushing it back. In the kitchen, he set the kettle on the stove and reached for the coffee. He measured the grounds by habit, not scale, poured them into the French press, and waited for the water to reach the right temperature. When it did, he poured slowly, stirred once, and stepped back. He did not watch the clock. While the coffee steeped, he sat at the small table near the window and opened his notebook. The pages were thick, slightly rough. He wrote a few lines. Not explanations, not plans, just marks that recorded what had already happened. A hinge that needed tightening, a length of rope that had worn thin, a tide that had come in higher than expected. He closed the notebook when the page felt complete. The coffee was ready. He poured it into a single mug and carried it to the chair facing the water. From there, the ocean filled the frame, whether he looked directly at it or not. The light had shifted slightly, enough to show movement on the surface without revealing detail. He drank slowly. When a mug was empty, he rinsed it and left it upside down on the counter. Then he pulled on his coat and stepped outside. The coastal path was damp from overnight mist. Grass bent under the weight of moisture. Pebbles pressed into the dirt where others had walked before him. He followed the curve of the land without adjusting his pace, boots finding familiar ground. Farther along, near a stretch of rock that dipped toward the water, a small group of harbor seals rested together. Their bodies lay close, dark shapes against darker stone. One lifted its head briefly when Caleb approached, then settled again. He sat on a piece of driftwood a short distance away. He did not move closer. He did not photograph them. He stayed and watched the water move around them, tracing the same pattern again and again until the repetition stopped registering as time passing at all. When he stood again, the cold had worked into his legs. He welcomed it. By the time he reached town, the morning had taken shape. The dock was awake now. Boats idled low, engines sounding almost restrained. Ropes creaked against pilings. Nets hung stiff with salt, catching the light in dull threads. Caleb stood near the edge of the pier and watched the fishermen work. He did not step in unless asked. When a line tangled around a cleat, he crouched, freed it, and handed it back without comment. The man took it and nodded once, already focused on the next task. At the diner, Caleb took his usual seat near the counter. Eggs, toast, coffee refilled without asking. He ate slowly, not reading the paper, not filling the space with talk. The room hummed around him, familiar voices rising and falling without anchoring anywhere. Afterward, he walked to the grocery store. The aisles were narrow. He picked up bread, soup, apples. At the register, the clerk slid the receipt across the counter. Their fingers did not touch. Outside, the air had warmed slightly, still damp, still gray. He stopped by the repair shop next. A jacket seam had begun to pull at the shoulder. He handed it over, explained the spot, and listened while the owner examined it. Norus, nonigo dushiashin. He would pick it up when it was ready. From there, he went to the library. The building stayed cool longer than most. He returned a book and chose another from the shelf without reading the back. He selected it by weight, by how it fit his hand. He sat at a table near the window and read until the light shifted enough to reach the page. That was his signal. He left before the room warmed. Back at the cottage, he fixed a loose hinge on the back door. The metal protested briefly, then settled. He stitched a small tear in his sweater, the repair visible but clean. He set the sweater aside and swept the porch, pushing damp leaves into a corner where the wind would eventually reclaim them. The afternoon passed quietly. Sometimes he walked the beach again. Sometimes he stood near the water longer than planned, watching waves flatten and reform without urgency. When a wind picked up sharply, he closed the windows and listened to it press against the walls. On Sundays, he went to the church. He arrived after the service had begun and slipped into the back pew. The wood creaked softly under his weight. Light filtered through tall windows in narrow bands, settling on worn floors and old hymnals. He did not bow his head. He did not speak. No prayer spoken. No doctrine. Only wood, light, and the back pew. He sat until the room felt settled, then left the way he came. In the evenings, when the town pulled inward again, Caleb sometimes went to the small bar near the harbor. He ordered soup or one drink and took a seat where he could listen without being drawn into conversation. If a chair wobbled, he tightened it. If a door stuck, he adjusted the latch. He did not announce the fixes. He paid and left. The routine did not belong only to him. It intersected with others without claiming them. The fisherman who nodded once. The clerk who remembered his order. the librarian who slid a book across the counter without comment. The town absorbed his presence the way it absorbed weather. He did not build these habits to mark time. He kept them so nothing broke. And if someone had been watching closely, they might have noticed how his days moved through the same spaces again and again, not to change them, not to be seen, but to keep them holding their shape. The ocean stayed steady. The town kept its rhythm, and Caleb Rowan moved within it, quietly, with a capacity that did not need to be explained, only repeated. She did not arrive as someone new. Iris Calder had already been part of the town long before Caleb Rowan registered her as a person rather than a pattern. People knew her the way they knew tide tables and shop hours. By repetition, by consistency, by what did not need to be announced. She unlocked her shop early, before the street fully woke. The bell above the door rang once, and then stayed quiet. Inside, the space held the faint smell of pressed fabric and clean wood. Light from the window fell across the work table at an angle she had adjusted over years, not for display, but for accuracy. The town treated her shop as necessary, not special. A hem repair before Sunday. A zipper replaced before the cold settled in. A coat reinforced where wind always found weakness first. People came in, set something down, said what it needed, and waited. Iris listened, nodded, and did the work. No extra questions. No stories pulled loose. That was how she stayed. Caleb first noticed her clearly on a morning that did not mark itself. Fog sat low along the street, thinning and thickening without deciding to lift. He stood outside the grocery store, shifting the weight of a paper bag in his hand, when he saw her near the bicycle rack. She was securing a bundle of fabric, too. The back of her bike. Her hands moved with practiced economy. Pull. Loop. Check. The wind lifted one loose corner, and she caught it without looking, fingers closing around the cloth as if the motion had already been accounted for. She tightened the strap once more and stopped. It would hold. Caleb waited a few steps away, not because he had to, but because the space asked for it. He did not hurry her. She did not speed up because he was there. When she stepped back, she noticed in the way people in town noticed most things. Without surprise, without pause. Her eyes lifted, met his briefly, then moved on. She gave a small nod. Not an opening. Not a question. Just acknowledgement. He nodded back. That was all. Later that week, he saw her again at the dock. She sat on a low bench near the end, notebook open on her lap, pencil resting across the page. She was not sketching the boats. She was writing measurements, numbers spaced evenly, pressing harder only when something needed to be precise. The tide moved beneath her boots, steady, unremarked. Caleb stood at the railing a short distance away. He did not look at her notebook. She did not look at his watch. The harbor filled the space between them with its usual sounds. Ropes creaking, water tapping against wood, a gull calling from farther out. A man unloading crates glanced at them both, then returned to his work. Two people sharing quiet did not register as unusual here. The detail that marked Iris as safe was not dramatic. It was how she handled interruption. When a delivery truck blocked the narrow street outside her shop one afternoon, she stepped out, assessed the angle, and moved a crate herself to clear space. She did not ask for help. She did not refuse it either. She made room and returned inside. When someone brought her a jacket with a torn seam and asked if it could be fixed by morning, she examined the fabric carefully and said, "It depends how it is worn. No promise. No performance." Caleb noticed that she never asked questions that required answers. She did not ask where he was from. She did not ask how long he planned to stay. She did not ask what he had done before this place, or what he intended next. There, exchanges, when they happened at all, stayed practical. At the library, she waited for him to finish turning a page before passing through the narrow aisle. "Morning," she said once. "Morning," he replied. Nothing followed. At the coffee shop, she took her cup black and sat by the window. Caleb sometimes stood at the counter until his was ready, then took it outside. When the timing overlapped, he took the chair across from her without asking. He did not pull it closer. He did not fill the space. She did not feel the need to explain what she was working on. She did not feel the need to define the silence. The town recognized her presence without ceremony. A glove returned to her counter without comment. A key left beside the register for someone who would come back later. A package accepted after hours and stored under the table, safe. Caleb registered this the way he registered weather. By pattern, by what held steady. One afternoon, walking the coastal path, the wind shifted sharply and fog rolled in fast, swallowing the curve ahead. Iris slowed and stopped, adjusting her jacket, eyes on the place where the path disappeared. Caleb stopped beside her, not close enough to crowd. Visibility drops quickly here, he said. She nodded. It lifts. They waited. When the fog thinned again, they continued walking, not side by side, but near enough to register each other's presence. Seals rested on the rocks that day, dark shapes against darker stone. Iris sat without comment. Caleb sat too. No one claimed the moment. In the evenings, they sometimes ended up at the same small bar near the harbor. Not together. Just there. Iris ordered soup instead of a drink. Caleb sat at the far end, hands around a glass he did not finish quickly. They left at different times, but not hurriedly. If someone had asked Iris who Caleb Rowan was to her, she would not have had an answer that fit neatly. He was not a project, not a question waiting to be solved. He was someone who stayed within his own lines. And in a town that understood familiarity without possession, that was enough to allow him to remain where he was, unexamined. The presence did not ask for trust. It allowed it. Quietly. Temporarily. The way a bench allows you to sit without asking where you are. Going next. The way a light stays on long enough to finish the work in front of you. Nothing more was required. Nothing more was offered. And the day continued. The first contact did not happen between them. It passed through someone else, carried by a task that needed doing and did not belong to either of them. Late afternoon settled into town with its usual restraint. The fog had thinned but not cleared, leaving the air damp and cool. The harbor moved steadily. Boats idled low. Ropes creaked as the tide adjusted them inch by inch. Iris called her locked her shop and turned the sign to back soon, then started toward the hardware and repair store 2 blocks down. She carried a folded jacket under her arm, the fabric worn thin along one shoulder. Inside the shop, the bell rang once. Shelves leaned slightly with age. The smell of oil and old wood stayed close to the floor. A radio played low behind the counter, more habit than sound. Caleb Rowan stood near the back, sorting through a shallow tray of brass screws. He had already chosen what he needed and was comparing 2 sizes by feel rather than sight. The owner had stepped away to answer the phone. Iris stopped just inside the door when she saw him. Not startled, just registering. She waited until he shifted, then spoke. "Excuse me." Caleb stepped aside without comment, giving her room to reach the counter. She placed the jacket down carefully, smoothing the sleeve once. The owner returned and picked it up, turning it over in his hands. "Seam came loose," Iris said. "Reinforced or just closed?" the owner asked. "Reinforced," she replied. "It carries weight there." Caleb glanced at the jacket then. The tear was small, clean, the kind that happened over time. The owner looked at him. "That yours?" Caleb nodded. "I can fix it by tomorrow," the owner said. "That works," Caleb replied. The exchange ended there. The owner carried the jacket toward the back room. The radio crackled briefly, then settled again. The bell rang as someone passed outside without coming in. A pause followed. "I did not charge for the stitching," the owner called from the back. Since she pointed it out, Iris shook her head. "Put on my tab." Caleb turned toward her. "You do not have to," he said. "I know," she replied. Nothing more was added. They walked out at the same time. Outside, the light had thinned toward evening. The road curved toward the water, darkened by mist. Somewhere down the block, a door closed. A gull cried once and went quiet. They stopped near the steps. "I'm heading toward the dock," Iris said. "So am I," Caleb replied. They did not coordinate pace. They walked. The dock was quieter now. Most boats were in. Nets hung still. The water moved evenly, catching what little light remained. They stopped near the railing, a few feet apart. Iris rested her hands on the wood, feeling the grain beneath her palms. "Wind is shifting," she said. "Yes," Caleb answered. Nothing followed. After a moment, She spoke again. They usually bring the fog back around dusk. He nodded. It does not last. They watched the water until the first layer of mist rolled in, softening the horizon. I should get back, Iris said. Of course. She turned, then paused. If the shoulder gives again, she said, bring it by earlier. That fabric responds better before it stretches. I will, Caleb replied. She left without waiting. Caleb stayed at the railing a while longer. No one had crossed the line. Nothing had been offered that required return. Nothing had been taken that needed explanation. The contact had passed through another person, through a jacket, through work that needed doing. It had not asked to be named. Later, someone unloading crates glanced once at the empty space where they had stood, then returned to tying a knot that had loosened again. The fog rolled back in. The town held the moment without comment and let it settle where it landed, the way it always did. The evening continued. The shift began with work that did not belong to him. It started early, before the shops opened and before the dock filled with voices. The tide had dropped lower than expected overnight. A skiff near the end of the pier listed just enough for its stern line to rub against a rusted cleat. The sound was faint but persistent, metal on fiber, repeating at a pace that did not match the waves. Caleb Rowan noticed it while passing through. He did not stop at first. He continued toward the end of the dock, checked the water line, then turned back. He loosened the line, adjusted the angle, and retied the knot with a shorter tail. He did not look around while doing it. He did not call out. By the time the skiff's owner arrived, the sound had stopped. The owner paused, looked at the line, then at Caleb. That was rubbing, the man said. Caleb nodded. The owner tested the knot once with his hand. All right, he said. Nothing else followed. By mid-morning, the fog lifted just enough to show the street again. The hardware store opened late. A crate of salt sat half-collapsed near the alley behind it, torn by damp overnight. White grains scattered into the gutter. Caleb passed it on his way to the post office, then returned. He pulled the crate upright, slid a piece of cardboard under one corner, and covered the top with a scrap of canvas folded twice. The salt stayed where it was. A woman from the bakery watched from her doorway. She said nothing. Inside the post office, the line moved slowly. When Caleb stepped aside to let someone else reach the counter first, the clerk nodded but did not comment. The radio above the sorting table crackled, then went quiet again. By the time Iris Calder arrived at her shop, the morning had already shifted shape. The jacket hung neatly behind the counter, the shoulder reinforced with careful stitching that followed the original seam. She touched it once, then hung it where it would not be seen from the street. Through the window, she noticed the crate by the hardware store was no longer sagging. She noticed the skiff sat straighter against the pier. She did not connect these things. Later, she stepped outside with a broom and swept the narrow strip of sidewalk in front of her shop. When she finished, the wind carried new debris in from the corner. She leaned the broom against the doorframe and went back inside. Caleb passed again around noon, carrying a coil of rope he had not purchased. The owner of the repair shop followed him out. You forgot to pay for that, the owner said. Caleb stopped. It was on the floor, he replied. The owner looked at the rope, then at the place where it had been stored. Leave it by the counter when you are done, he said. I will, Caleb answered. They did not smile. The rope went to the dock. A piling near the ferry ramp had worked loose just enough to shift when stepped on. Caleb wrapped the rope around it twice, pulling it tight against the adjacent post. The movement stopped. A ferry worker saw him. That is not your job, the worker said. Caleb stepped back, tested the tension once with his foot, then nodded. No, he said. The worker looked at the rope, then shrugged. Do not leave it there overnight, he added. I will not, Caleb replied. The rope was gone by evening. Word did not travel the way it usually did. No one pointed. No one thanked him publicly. No one corrected him either. By late afternoon, the town adjusted around the changes without naming them. The dock felt quieter. The alley smelled less sharp with salt. The ferry ramp did not shift underfoot. Iris noticed the difference while carrying a small table outside to adjust the window display. The street felt steadier, less interrupted. She set the table down, adjusted the angle of a folded cloth, then stepped back. Caleb stood across the street. He was not watching her. He was looking at the frame of the window, the way the light caught the edge of the glass where it met the wood. A truck passed between them, slow and loud. When it cleared, Iris had already turned back inside. That evening, at the small bar near the harbor, Caleb took a seat at the end. The bartender placed a glass of water in front of him before he asked. "You fixed the piling," the bartender said, not looking up. Caleb did not respond. "You did not have to," the bartender added. Caleb lifted the glass, then set it down again. "I know," he said. "That was all." At the other end of the bar, someone mentioned the ferry ran smoother that day. Someone else said the fog held longer than usual. The conversation shifted. No one raised their voice. Iris arrived later, sat 2 stools away, and ordered tea. She noticed the coil of rope was no longer by the door where it sometimes rested. She did not ask. When she stood to leave, Caleb shifted his chair back, slightly, to give her room. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he replied. Outside, the air had cooled. The street lights blurred at the edges. Iris walked toward the corner, then stopped when she saw the crate of salt had been moved fully inside the alley, protected from the damp. She stood there for a moment, then continued. The next morning, the shift became clearer. A fisherman retied his own lines before leaving the dock, noticing they held better than usual. A delivery truck took the corner without slowing as much. The repair shop owner found the rope folded neatly by the counter, dry and clean. When he looked up, Caleb was already halfway down the street. At the shop, Iris adjusted the window again. She moved the table 2 inches to the left. The reflection changed. Across the street, Caleb stopped. This time he did look. Iris noticed him noticing. She did not wave. She adjusted the table once more, then stepped back, arms at her sides. The reflection settled. Caleb nodded once, not to her, but to the window itself. Then he walked on. The town did not react the way it usually did when something changed. There was no story attached, no explanation offered. The work remained what it was, present, unclaimed, finished. By evening, the dock had taken on its familiar rhythm again, but something in the spacing had shifted. People moved through it without adjusting their steps as often. Someone standing near the end of the pier watched Caleb pass and thought, briefly, that the place felt easier to stand in. They did not say it out loud. The first shift held. It did not announce itself. It stayed where it was placed and waited. The town did not speak about the changes out loud. They showed up instead in pauses. On the dock, people stood a fraction longer before stepping aside. At the corner by the hardware store, drivers slowed without touching the brake as hard. In front of Iris Calder's shop, the light stayed on the glass a few seconds past noon before sliding away. Caleb Rowan noticed these things because he was no longer avoiding them. That afternoon, he walked the long way back from the post office. The route took him past the harbor road, then behind a row of wooden houses that leaned toward the water. A narrow footpath cut between 2 sheds and opened into a small clearing where the tide sometimes reached during storms. He stopped there. The water was low. The mud showed old footprints, layered and faded, none of them his. He stood at the edge, hands loose at his sides, and waited until the wind softened again. From the other end of the path, Iris appeared. She had not planned to be there. She carried a folded drop cloth under one arm, the kind used to protect floors during fitting sessions. The path was simply shorter than going around the street, and she had taken it without thinking. When she saw him, she slowed. Caleb did not turn. He was facing the water. She could have turned back. She did not. Her steps changed instead. Quieter. Slower. She stopped several yards behind him, far enough that her presence could be ignored, close enough that it could not be mistaken. The space between them held. Neither spoke. The gulls cried somewhere beyond the houses. The tide shifted, making a shallow sound against the reeds. Iris adjusted her grip on the cloth, then let her arms rest again. Caleb shifted his weight once, then settled. She watched his outline rather than his face, the way his shoulders remained level, the way he did not look for a reason to turn. After a while, the wind moved through the clearing, cool and steady. It lifted the edge of the drop cloth slightly, then let it fall back against Iris's arm. Caleb glanced over his shoulder. Not fully, just enough. Their eyes met for a brief moment, unannounced. No signal followed. No question formed. He turned back to the water. Iris exhaled without sound. She remained where she was. When she finally stepped forward, it was not toward him. She moved past, keeping the same distance, the same pace. The cloth brushed against her leg as she walked. At the end of the path, she stopped again. "The tide turns fast here," she said, her voice even. Caleb nodded once. "I know," he replied. That was all. She continued on. Later, the town's rhythm gathered itself again. At the grocery store, Iris reached for a bag of flour at the same time as another woman. They paused, smiled briefly, then adjusted. The bag remained on the shelf until one of them took it. Outside, Caleb loaded a small crate into the back of a borrowed truck. The owner stood nearby, arms crossed, watching. Caleb finished, closed the tailgate, and stepped back. "You can leave it there," the owner said. Caleb nodded. He did. Not linger. That evening, the fog returned earlier than expected. It softened the streetlights and shortened the distance between corners. From her shop window, Iris watched people move past as shapes rather than faces. Across the street, Caleb stopped again. This time, he faced the window directly. The glass reflected both of them. Iris saw herself standing inside, hands resting lightly on the edge of the counter. She saw him outside, his outline steady against the glow. Neither moved. The reflection held until a car passed, breaking apart. When the street cleared, Caleb was still there. Iris lifted one hand slightly, not in greeting, not in dismissal, just a small movement, enough to register. Caleb did not respond with a gesture. He stayed where he was, then stepped back once, giving the window its space again. The distance between them remained intact. Later, at the bar, they did not sit near each other. The stools between them stayed empty. The bartender moved down the line, refilling glasses without comment. At one point, the music on the radio cut out, leaving only the low hum of voices and the sound of ice shifting in glasses. No one rushed to fix it. The pause lasted. Someone near the door took a slow breath, then another. The radio came back on by itself. Iris finished her tea and stood. Caleb shifted his chair again, creating space without looking at her. She passed without touching him. Outside, the fog thickened. They walked in the same direction for a block, separated by the width of the street. Their footsteps did not match. At the corner, Iris turned. Caleb continued straight. Neither looked back. The next morning, the town felt unchanged on the surface. The dock held. The shop windows reflected the gray sky. The tide moved in and out with its usual patience. But the spaces between people carried a new awareness. When someone paused, they let the pause stay. When a breath slowed, no one hurried along. Across the street from a shop, Caleb stopped once more. This time, Iris did not look up right away. She adjusted a seam, smoothed a fold, then stepped back. Only then did she meet his gaze through the glass. They held it longer than before. Not long enough to settle anything. Long enough to notice the distance itself. The moment passed without decision. Caleb moved. On. Inside the shop, Iris remained still for a few seconds after he left. The street outside continued its quiet work. Somewhere nearby, someone paused mid-step and waited for the space to open. It did. The town breathed on, unchanged in shape, altered in timing. The silence between them stayed, not heavy, not empty, just present. And for now, that was enough to hold the day together. The next morning arrived without announcement. The street outside Iris called her shop looked the same. Gray light slid along the windows. The tide was already turning, slow and unremarked. Inside, Iris folded fabric on a long table near the back, her movement steady, familiar. Caleb Rowan passed the shop once without stopping. He noticed the door was open. Not wide, just enough. Later, near the harbor road, they crossed paths again. This time it was unavoidable. The sidewalk narrowed where the fence leaned inward, and the fog pressed closer than usual. Caleb stepped aside first. Not dramatically, just a half step toward the curb, leaving the center open. Iris paused, then passed him. Her shoulders stayed aligned with the fence, keeping distance intact. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he replied. No extra words followed. They continued in opposite directions. At the dock, Caleb worked alone. He adjusted a loose plank near the edge, one that shifted slightly underfoot when the tide was low. The tools he used were borrowed. He returned each one to the crate after finishing, wiping them clean before closing the lid. Iris watched from farther down the pier while waiting for a delivery that had not yet arrived. She did not walk over. When Caleb finished, he stood, stretched his back once, and looked down the length of the dock. Iris remained where she was, her hands resting on the railing. Their distance held. Later that afternoon, they met again at the grocery store. The aisles were narrow, shelves close enough that people adjusted their paths without speaking. Caleb reached for a loaf of bread. Iris waited behind him. He took the loaf, stepped aside, and set it into his basket. He did not turn right away. The space he left was deliberate. Iris moved forward, selected the same brand, then nodded once. He nodded back. At the register, she finished first. Outside, she stopped near the bench by the door to adjust the strap of her bag. Caleb exited. A moment later, they stood side by side, not touching, both facing the parking lot. "I am heading toward the harbor," Iris said. Caleb shifted his weight. "I'm going inland." Neither statement asked anything. They walked together as far as the corner. At the crosswalk, they stopped. The light took its time. Cars passed. A gull landed briefly on the signpost, then lifted away again. Iris glanced down the road toward the water. Caleb looked in the opposite direction, where the houses rose slightly and the streets curved out of sight. "You do not have to answer yet," Iris said quietly. The words landed between them without pressure. Caleb did not reply. The light changed. They crossed separately. That evening, the town settled into its usual pattern. The bar filled slowly. The radio stayed low. People took their places without comment. Iris arrived first and chose a stool near the end. She ordered tea. The bartender nodded and set it down without asking again. Caleb entered later. He did not take the empty stool beside her. He chose 2 seats away. The space between them remained unused. At one point, the bartender placed a bowl of peanuts on the counter, sliding it to the center. Iris took one, then stopped. Caleb reached for one as well, his hand pausing briefly when he noticed hers already there. She withdrew first. He took one, then slid the bowl slightly back toward her before returning it to the center. Neither looked up. When Iris stood to leave, Caleb adjusted his stool back to make room. She passed behind him without contact. Outside, the air felt colder, the fog thinning. They walked in the same direction for half a block. Then Iris slowed. Caleb continued. She stopped near a shop. He did not turn around. Inside, Iris locked the door and stood for a moment with her hand on the key. The street lamp across the road flickered once, then steadied. Farther up the street, Caleb paused near the curve where the sidewalk dipped. He looked back toward the row of shops, then forward again. The town did not mark the moment. No decision was made. No boundary was crossed. What remained was a small adjustment in distance, measured carefully, respected by both. The night closed in as it always did, leaving space exactly where it had been left. The next day carried. A little more movement, though nothing announced it as change. The weather shifted without warning. By mid-morning, the fog thinned, then returned again, rolling in uneven bands from the water. The dock creaked more than usual. Ropes tapped lightly against hulls. Someone adjusted a radio and turned it back down. Caleb Rowan spent the morning near the shoreline path where the rocks broke the surf into smaller, quieter sounds. He carried a canvas bag with tools he rarely needed all at once. Today, he used only one. A loose railing along the path had begun to lean outward. Not enough to fall, enough to catch a sleeve. Caleb knelt and tightened the bolts by hand before using the wrench. He worked slowly, checking each point twice. When he finished, he stepped back, pressed once then again. The railing held. He left without marking it. Later, Iris Calder walked that same stretch on her way back from the post office. She paused at the repaired spot, her hand resting briefly on the wood. She did not look for who had fixed it. She continued on, her pace unchanged. Near the dock, a small moment gathered attention and then dispersed. One of the lobster boats shifted unexpectedly as the tide pulled harder than expected. A crate near the edge slid a few inches closer to the water. The sound carried farther than it should have. A man at the far end of the pier stepped toward it. So did Caleb. Both stopped at the same time. The crate settled on its own. Nothing fell. No one hurried. The man shrugged and returned to his work. Caleb remained still for a moment longer, then turned away. The dock returned to its rhythm. In the afternoon, Iris worked inside her shop with the door open. The wind moved the hanging fabrics slightly, enough to change how the light passed through them. She adjusted one piece, then left it alone. A woman from town stopped by to pick up a repaired coat. They spoke briefly, standing near the counter. "It looks good," the woman said. Iris nodded. "It holds." After the woman left, Iris swept the floor. She paused when she noticed a small tear beginning near the hem of a sample piece hanging by the window. She reached for a needle, threaded it, and made 2 stitches. The tear closed. Across the street, Caleb passed again. He noticed the movement of her hands through the glass. He slowed, then continued on. At the grocery store later that evening, the power flickered once. The lights dimmed, then returned. No one reacted beyond a few raised heads. At the freezer aisle, a carton slipped from a child's hands and slid across the floor. It stopped near Caleb's feet. He bent, picked it up, and held it out. The child took it without speaking. The parent nodded once. That was all. Iris stood one aisle over, choosing between jars. She heard the sound, but did not turn. When she reached the checkout, Caleb was already paying. He stepped aside to let her pass, holding the door as they exited. Outside, a light drizzle had begun. Not enough to open umbrellas. Enough to darken the pavement. They stood beneath the awning for a moment, both waiting for the same thing to pass. A car drove by slowly, tires whispering against the wet road. Iris adjusted the collar of her coat. Caleb shifted his bag higher on his shoulder. Neither spoke. The rain thinned. They stepped away at the same time, heading in the same direction for half a block. At the fork where the road curved inland and the path continued toward the water, Iris slowed. Caleb continued straight. He glanced once toward the harbor. Iris noticed and followed his line of sight. A boat had pulled in slightly off course, its angle awkward against the dock. The captain adjusted the rope and corrected it without assistance. Nothing required intervention. They continued on. That night, the bar filled earlier than usual. A storm was expected offshore, though it had not yet reached land. The windows fogged quickly. Caleb took his usual seat. Iris arrived later and chose a table instead of the counter. The space between them was larger tonight, not smaller. A server set down a plate at the wrong table by mistake. Iris touched the edge lightly and shook her head. The server apologized and moved it away. Caleb noticed and looked back down at his glass. When Iris stood to leave, she hesitated near the door, waiting for a gust of wind to pass before stepping outside. Caleb reached it first and held it open, bracing it with his shoulder. She passed through. He released the door and followed. Outside, the air smelled sharper salt, heavier on the wind. The clouds moved quickly overhead, breaking apart and rejoining. They walked side by side for a short distance, far enough to share the same sound of footsteps, not close enough to brush leaves. At the corner, Iris turned. Caleb continued straight. Neither looked back this time. Behind them, the town kept its shape. Small adjustments settled into place. Nothing dramatic held. Nothing needed saving. What lingered were the minor motions, the unremarked courtesies, the moments where something could have happened and did not. They accumulated quietly, like tide lines on stone, changing the surface without breaking it. The next morning brought a small shift that did not announce itself. At the coffee shop near the corner, a chalkboard sign had been rewritten overnight. The letters were neat but slightly uneven, as though the person who wrote them had paused once and continued anyway. A price was listed incorrectly by a few cents. No one mentioned it. Caleb Rowan arrived earlier than usual and took a seat by the window. He ordered the same coffee he always did. When it arrived, the cup was placed closer to the edge of the table than before. He adjusted it without comment. Across the room, 2 people spoke quietly while waiting. One of them glanced toward the window and lowered their voice. "He is still around," the person said, not naming anyone. The other nodded. "I thought he was leaving." "So did I." The words stayed between them. They did not move beyond the table. Later that morning, Iris called her, opened her shop, and noticed that the repaired railing along the shoreline path had been mentioned in passing at the hardware store. Someone said it had been fixed by the man who walks early. The detail stopped there. No name was attached. By the time Iris reached the path, the tide had shifted again. The railing stood as it had the day before. She paused near it, longer than necessary, then continued on. At the dock, a folded tarp lay where it had not been before. The color matched one Caleb sometimes carried, though not exactly. The similarity lingered long enough to be noticed, then faded. A fisherman picked it up, shook it once, and set it aside. "That must be his," someone said nearby, already turning away. The tarp remained unclaimed. In the afternoon, Iris worked with the front. Door open. A delivery arrived late. She signed for it and stacked the boxes herself. One was heavier than expected and tipped slightly as she lifted it. A man passing by slowed, then kept walking. The box settled on the floor without damage. Iris stood still for a moment, then bent and adjusted the stack. The work continued. Across the street, Caleb noticed the brief pause through the glass. He did not cross over. That evening, the bar filled slowly. The television above the counter played with the sound turned down. A storm had passed offshore without reaching land. The air felt clearer afterward. Caleb sat at the same place. Iris arrived later and chose the stool 2 seats away from him. Not her usual table, not beside him either. A server approached with 2 glasses, hesitated, and set one down in front of Iris that had been meant for someone else. The mistake was noticed immediately. "I am sorry," the server said, reaching to correct it. Iris shook her head. "It is fine." She slid the glass a few inches toward Caleb instead. "Yours." He looked at it, then at her. "That is not what I ordered." "It will do," she said. The server returned with the correct drink for Iris and moved on. Caleb did not comment. He took the glass and drank. From the far end of the bar, someone noticed the exchange and drew a quiet conclusion that did not fully fit what they had seen. The detail was small, but it repeated once later when the story was told again. "They sit together now," the person said, not unkindly. No one corrected it. When Iris finished her drink, she stood and reached for her coat. Caleb rose at the same time, though his glass was not empty. Outside, the street was quiet. The lamps cast a softer light than usual, the bulbs dimmed slightly by the damp air. They walked together for a short distance, close enough that their steps aligned, far enough that their shoulders did not touch. At the corner, Iris slowed and stopped. "I will take the long way," she said. Caleb nodded. "I will head back." They did not exchange reasons. As she turned, Iris glanced once toward the dock. Caleb followed her gaze, then looked away. The moment held, then released. The next day, the chalkboard at the coffee shop still showed the incorrect price. Someone paid it without noticing. Someone else noticed and said nothing. The tarp by the dock had been folded differently and placed on a bench. No one claimed it. No one removed it. Caleb passed the hardware store and did not go in. Iris walked the shoreline path and rested her hand on the railing again, briefly, as if confirming its presence. The small misinterpretation remained in circulation, unchanged, not corrected, not expanded. It shifted how people placed them together, then apart, without either of them addressing it. Nothing resolved. What changed was the distance, measured not in steps, but in how long a pause lasted, where a glance settled, and how a shared moment ended slightly earlier or slightly later than before. The town absorbed the difference quietly and moved on. The next shift arrived without a marker on the calendar. Caleb Rowan noticed it first in the way people did not look up anymore when he passed. The glances that had once paused, measured, or tried to place him softened into something else. Not familiarity exactly, more like accommodation. At the grocery store, the clerk rang his items without comment and slid the receipt toward him before he asked. The total was correct. The change came back exact. The exchange took less than a minute, and when it ended, there was no sense that anything had been added or taken away. Outside, a man loading salt bags into a truck nodded once at Caleb. Not as greeting, not as dismissal, just acknowledgement. Caleb returned the nod and kept walking. Along the shoreline path, the repaired railing had weathered another night of damp air. The wood had darkened slightly, settling into the color of everything else along the coast. Someone had tightened one bolt. Someone else had left it alone. Caleb stood there longer than usual, hands in his pockets, looking not at the water but at the path itself. People passed him. Some slowed. Some did not. A woman walking her dog stopped a few feet away to adjust the leash. The dog pulled toward the water and then back again. "He is fine," the woman said to no one in particular, more to the dog than to Caleb. She finished adjusting the leash and moved on. Later, at the dock, a small skiff bumped lightly against the pilings. Its owner had not arrived yet. The rope was looped twice instead of once, holding firm against the tide. Caleb reached out, tested it, and stepped back. He did not untie it. That afternoon, Iris Calder worked with the door closed. The light inside her shop shifted as clouds passed, turning the space cooler, then warmer again. Fabric lay folded on the main table, untouched for a long stretch. She noticed Caleb through the window only because he was not looking in. He crossed the street, stopped briefly at the bulletin board near the post office, and read notices that had been there all week. A handwritten sign about a potluck. A lost glove. A meeting that had already happened. He took one step back, then another, giving space to a man pinning up a new notice. When the man finished, Caleb did not read it. He moved on. Iris watched him until he turned the corner. When he reached the bar that evening, a stool was open beside the one he usually took. He did not sit there. He chose the seat with his back to the wall, leaving the open space between. The bartender set down his drink without asking. The glass was clean. The pour was measured. "You staying?" the bartender asked, not looking up. "For now," Caleb said. That was all. Across the room, Iris arrived later than usual. She took a table near the window. When the server approached, Iris gestured once toward the bar. "That is fine," she said, indicating she would wait. She did not move closer. Caleb noticed her reflection in the mirror behind the bottles. He did not turn around. The bar filled, then thinned. Conversations overlapped and faded. A radio played softly somewhere near the back. At one point, a chair scraped loudly as someone stood. The sound cut through the room and settled again. Caleb finished his drink and set the glass down carefully. He did not order another. When he stood, Iris looked up. Their eyes met briefly across the space between them. No signal passed. No question. Caleb nodded once, the same nod he had given the man with the salt bags. Iris returned it. Outside, the air was colder than expected. The tide was lower now, revealing dark bands of rock along the shore. Caleb walked toward the water, then stopped and turned inland instead. He passed the hardware store and did not go in. The next morning, he woke before the light shifted. He made coffee and drank it standing by the window. The cup cooled in his hands before he finished it. On the table, a folded map lay where he had left it days earlier. The edges were worn. The route he had traced was still visible. He did not unfold it. Instead, he put on his coat and stepped outside. The fog was thinner today. The town emerged gradually, as it often did. At the dock, a fisherman struggled briefly with a crate. Caleb moved closer, stopped, and waited. The fisherman adjusted his grip and lifted it on his own. "Got it," the fisherman said, not sharply, not kindly, just stating fact. Caleb stepped back and nodded. As he walked away, he heard the crate set down safely. In the afternoon, Iris rearranged the front of her shop. Not a full change, just a shift in spacing. The window caught the light differently afterward, reflecting the street more than the interior. When Caleb passed, he saw himself briefly in the glass. Not clearly, enough to recognize shape and movement. He did not stop. Later, Iris closed early and walked the shoreline path alone. At the railing, she rested her hand once, then let it fall. The tide was turning again. She noticed the rope on the skiff still looped twice. She left it that way. By the time evening came, the town had settled into its usual rhythm. Lights turned on. Doors closed. The sound of waves continued, steady and unremarkable. Caleb sat at a small table and wrote a single line on a blank page. The words were plain. He read them once and did not add to them. When he stood to put the notebook away, he placed it in a drawer rather than his bag. Across town, Iris turned off the last light in her shop and locked the door. She paused on the step, listening to the street. Nothing required her attention. She walked home. The realization did not arrive as a thought or a sentence. It showed itself in what Caleb did not do. He did not prepare to leave. He did not announce staying. He did not explain himself to anyone. He adjusted instead, making room without claiming it. The town responded in kind, not with acceptance or refusal, but with use. He became part of the pattern, neither centered nor removed. Iris noticed the shift and did not interrupt it. When their paths crossed after that, it was without pause or expectation. Sometimes they walked the same direction. Sometimes they did not. The space between them remained, clear and respected. And within that space, the town continued, unchanged on the surface, slightly reordered underneath, as though a piece had been set down where it fit well enough to remain. The routine returned without announcing itself. Caleb Rowan woke at the same hour as before, while the sky was still holding its gray. The sound of the water reached him through the open window, steady, familiar. He stood there longer than he used to, not waiting for anything, just letting the air move through the room before he closed the window against the cold. Coffee came next. The same kettle, the same grounds. The difference was not in the steps, but in the order. He poured the water first this time, then reached for the cup. Steam rose and faded before he took the first sip. He drank it by the table instead of the window. Outside, the town was already awake in its quiet way. A truck passed along the road, slower than traffic elsewhere, tires hissing softly on damp pavement. Somewhere down the block, a door opened and closed. Caleb put on his coat and stepped out. He walked toward the shoreline, but instead of going straight there, he turned inland first. The grocery store opened early. He went in, picked up only what he needed, and left without lingering by the shelves. The clerk nodded once. Nothing else passed between them. From there, he headed to the dock. The path was the same, but his pace was not. He stopped briefly where the railing met the bend, then continued on without leaning against it. The skiff was still there. The rope was still looped twice. Caleb did not touch it. A fisherman worked nearby, mending a net. Caleb watched for a moment, then moved on. The fisherman did not look up. The net did not tear. No one stepped in. Later in the morning, Caleb sat on a low rock near the water. The seals were farther out today, dark shapes rising and dipping with the swell. He watched them until the tide shifted enough to change the rhythm of their movement. He left before they did. At the library, he returned a book he had not finished. He did not replace it with another. The librarian checked it in without comment and slid it onto the cart. Outside, the fog thinned and lifted. The town sharpened into focus. Wooden houses, weathered and steady, stood where they always had. The road curved along the coast, unchanged. Across town, Iris Calder unlocked her shop and let the light in. The space inside was arranged much as it had been before. Tables where tables belonged. Fabric folded neatly. Tools laid out in reach. She changed nothing at first. She opened the window instead. The sound of the street entered, muted by glass and distance. A car passed. Someone laughed briefly, then moved on. Iris worked with the door open for a while, then closed it again when the air cooled. She stepped outside near midday and walked toward the post office. The bulletin board had a new notice pinned, slightly crooked. She straightened it without reading. When she reached the shoreline path, she stopped at the same place she always did. Her hand hovered near the railing and then fell back to her side. She did not rest it there. Caleb passed her on the path, heading the opposite direction. They exchanged no words. Their steps did not slow. They walked on. That evening, Caleb went to the bar earlier than usual and left earlier too. He sat at the same stool, ordered the same drink, and finished it without watching the room. When he stood, the stool remained empty. Iris did not come in that night. Instead, she walked home by the longer route, following the curve of the road where the water stayed in view. The town lights reflected faintly on the surface, broken by the movement of the tide. Back in his room, Caleb laid out his tools and put them away again without using them. He wrote nothing. He folded the map and placed it at the bottom of the drawer. The routine held. The places were the same. The sequence was not. Maine stayed quiet, as it always had. The dock creaked. The road bent along the coast. The light shifted and returned. Within that steadiness, something had adjusted. Not enough to be named. Enough to be felt in how space was used, and how it was left open. The day ended without marking itself. The next morning came the same way. The town stayed where it had always been. Morning came in the same muted light, spreading across the water and settling on the wooden houses along the shore. The dock creaked as the tide shifted. A gull crossed the sky, called once, and moved on. Nothing announced an ending. Caleb Rowan walked the familiar road without checking the time. He passed the same storefronts, the same windows, some arranged just a little differently than before. One of them caught the light in a way that held for a second longer than usual. He did not stop. He did not turn away either. Inside her shop, Iris Calder worked with the door open. The space held its shape now. What needed changing had already been changed. She adjusted a sleeve on a form, stepped back, then left it as it was. The room felt finished without feeling closed. People moved through the town, as they always did. A fisherman hauled a crate. Someone swept a step. A truck paused at the corner and continued on. Familiar faces passed one another with small nods that did not require follow-up. Caleb reached the edge of the water and stood there. The tide was neither high nor low. It moved on its own schedule. He stayed until the rhythm settled, then turned back toward town. Iris locked her door at the end of the day and placed the key in her pocket. She took the long way home, following the curve of the road where the ocean stayed in view. The light faded, then returned in reflections from the water. They did not meet again that evening. The town did not need them to. What remained was simple and steady, a place where people were seen without being measured, where work could be done without explanation, where staying did not have to be justified, and leaving did not have to be dramatic. Life here moved by repetition, but it was not stuck. Small choices changed the shape of days. Boundaries made space for trust. Silence carried more weight than declarations. As nights settled in, the lights along the coast came on one by one. The road curved into darkness. The water kept moving. Some things stayed because they belonged. Others stayed because no one asked them to leave. The town remained open, holding its quiet, allowing room for whoever continued walking its roads a little longer.